FiLiA means daughter. We are the daughters of the women who came before us, and we fight so that our daughters may be free. We are a women-led volunteer organization. Our vision is a world free from patriarchy, where all women and girls are liberated. We seek to contribute to the women's liberation movement by building sisterhood and solidarity among women, locally, nationally, and globally. By amplifying the voices of women, particularly those less often heard or purposefully silenced, and by defending women's human rights.
Hello, dear visitors. Thank you for coming to the second part of the FiLiA webinar, Sex Trade Survivors Demanding the Global Change. I am Luba Fine from FiLiA. 13 exited survivors from 12 different countries are participating in this webinar. Let me introduce our first speaker now. This is Esther from London. Esther has a long-standing interest in research on criminal and civil justice systems. In her opinion, those systems file women subjected to domestic and sexual violence. After exiting prostitution, she became an activist and a clear, powerful voice against the sex trade. Esther's activism was motivated by what happened and continued to happen to women she met who were still involved in it. Esther is also a real intellectual and contributed her brilliant analysis to the websites Nordic Model Now and FiLiA. I envy those who are going to listen to Esther for the first time today. So thank you so much for coming here, and let's listen to you.
This piece of doggerel verse underneath here is something that was passed on to me by a relative who picked it up in service during World War II, when he, and particularly felt it sharply when he returned to the peace and discovered that the same social class ran everything. This is a graph of the annual UK household expenditure on prostitution between 1997 and 2020. It's from the Office for National Statistics, published in June. It shows the, in fact, very high number of amount of money estimated. These were estimates which were done by the Office for National Statistics to try and add to the picture of economic activity in the UK. And you can also see the drop 2019 to 2020. So since 2014, ONS has included these estimated figures on drugs and prostitution, reflecting a broader picture of economic activity in the UK. And Dr. Belinda Brooks-Gordon, who was the principal investigator who was responsible for developing this way of looking at it and analysing the spending, said in 2016, the total number of sex workers in the UK is estimated to 72,800, comprising of approximately 32,000 in London and 41,000 outside. Their total gross annual income earned from sex work is estimated to be 5.09 billion, leading to a net income after costs of 1.23 billion. This was put out in evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee for its report on prostitution, and is clearly meant to emphasise to the committee members what a lot of money is in total. But if you look at that, there are obviously a lot of assumptions made in how they worked out these figures, because it was extrapolated from a large number of women in London, and there are a lot of geographical variations. But that meaning that that's 24.2% net income for that gross figure. And the Office for National Statistics estimated that prostitute women were seeing an average of 29 clients a week, charging them a mean of £67, rising for 6 years to 78 and then down to 73 in 2016. But that actually means a net income per client of £16 and then up to £19 in 2015 and then £18 in 2016. And this is a kind of example of the way in which people's sort of or the presentation of the kind of the money that comes from prostitution and the likely earnings from it are consistently misrepresented. Things like the connection between your involvement in the porn industry or the higher levels of remuneration you get from that is rarely mentioned, even in connection with, for example, the previous incumbent of the White House. And the mean rate also takes no account of which services are included in that. Increasing numbers of women entering the sex trade as a result of austerity or through having been trafficked into the United Kingdom are competing for men wanting to perform acts that they have seen in online porn, possession of which would actually be illegal in the UK, but many of which are, only those acts are not unlawful if they're carried out in real life. And that's resulted in many services which are dangerous, attracting a much lower level of remuneration. And then normalization outside the sex industry is a major factor in the onslaught of harassment and sexual violence to which young women in particular are being subject. I wanted to point out that the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey 2014 found that the only age range in which PTSD was more often diagnosed in men than women was 55 to 64, and that the highest incidence of it was in women aged between 16 and 24. There seems to be very little interest in why that might be the case. So this is a general outline about policy and legislation in England and Wales. So performing sexual services for financial reward and paying for them are legal in England and Wales. But related offences like soliciting, loitering on the streets, keeping brothels, etc., are criminal offences, as are a lot of the offences connected with trafficking and sort of controlling women in prostitution here and around the world. So the joint approach of the Home Office, the police and the Crown Prosecution Service is to help people involved in prostitution to develop routes out of it with support from other agencies. And the Crown Prosecution Service focuses on the people who recruit others into prostitution by charging offences like causing, inciting or controlling prostitution or trafficking. And that's partly because they attract longer sentences and provide opportunities for asset seizure. And policy and legislation in Scotland and Northern Ireland are now devolved matters for the respective governments. So I'm going to speak a bit about them, particularly about Scotland, but most of what I'm saying is about England and Wales. But the laws in all three of these jurisdictions are broadly similar, except that while performing sexual services for reward is legal in all of them, paying for sex has been a criminal offence in Northern Ireland since 2015 Act, Human Trafficking and Exploitation, Criminal Justice and Support for Victims Act. So these are some of the offences related to prostitution in England and Wales: loitering, curb crawling, and then the other ones which are involving trafficking. And the powers to deal with offenders are kind of are shared between the police and the Crown Prosecution Service in England and Wales. So police officers who arrest people who they think have committed the offences which have lower maximum penalties, which can only be tried in magistrates' courts, which is like loitering and soliciting, curb crawling, paying for sexual services or keeping a brothel, they can report them to the prosecutors at the Crown Prosecution Service, like can refer them up, or they can bring charges themselves. They also have powers to issue notices and then apply to a court for an order which would close premises associated with specified offences for up to 3 months, and that can be extended for a further 3 months, making a total of 6 if the court considers it necessary. And these are important factors in how the police approach their role. Individual police officers, they have discretion about what they consider to be the most appropriate response or action to take. This is about any criminal activity which is either observed by them or reported to them. And the chief constables, who are in charge of the 43 police forces in England and Wales, they have overall operational independence and they're responsible for the direction and control of the forces. Scotland and Northern Ireland have single police forces. And then we also have elected officials called police and crime commissioners, who are responsible for maintaining efficient and effective forces and delivering local police and crime plans, but they cannot fetter the operational independence of the police force and the chief constable. And then the Home Secretary has ministerial responsibility for policing in England and Wales. And then I was going to talk a bit about policing by consent. These are a series of philosophical principles which were first included in instructions to new police officers in 1829, and they emphasize that power of the police to fulfill their functions and duties depends on public approval of their existence, actions and behavior, and on their ability to secure and maintain public respect. And the principle that police forces police by consent and the individual police constable's discretion and need to prioritize use of resources means that in practice the police make some choices about enforcing the criminal law, and this is not only the case where prostitution is concerned. The Crown Prosecution Service, they deal with cases which are referred up to them, and also if they're cases which are more serious to begin with, they would be dealing with them. And when they're looking at things, they always look at two things. One is there enough evidence against them for whatever the charge is? And then is it in the public interest for the Crown Prosecution Service to bring the case to court? And they have a code for Crown prosecutors, and where prostitution is concerned, they have specific guidance on the individual offences. So between different police forces, because of this issue of individual discretion and operational independence, there's quite a lot of variety in how policing and prostitution has been dealt with. And the 2014 report showed that the policing and enforcement unevenly prioritized and resourced as it was. There were only a few exceptions possible, and where extraordinary political leadership had happened at a local level. And they took the view that at worst this could trap women in cycles of abuse and prevent them exiting prostitution. And several of the witnesses who gave evidence to the Home Affairs Committee's inquiry in 2016 particularly mentioned the unfair targeting of enforcement at females involved in prostitution rather than male sex buyers. So these are some initiatives that have been carried out in local UK forces. There's Norfolk and Suffolk in particular, initiatives that they took around street prostitution and using the curb crawling, and a zero tolerance initiative in the case of Suffolk police, which effectively eliminated street prostitution there. And there are also some in Scotland, and massage parlours, which had been set up and saunas in Edinburgh. There were big raids on them in 2013 by Police Scotland. The police forces in Scotland were consolidated into a single force, and a lot of them were closed down. And an establishment of a managed area for street prostitution in the Holbeck area of Leeds has proved to be ineffective, damaging in predictable ways to the neighbourhood and surrounding areas, and has now ended following public protests and direct action. One of the actual advantages of the fact that we have had different forces doing different things is that you can see when some things have worked and some haven't. It's so precisely because of that, it's a bit like different kind of trialing of policies out. And enforcement of laws on things like soliciting will differ in affluent neighbourhoods, where residents fear the impact on their property values in a country in the UK, as we know, many people's main asset is their home. And a combination of that and that affects quite a lot of things about how things work. And sometimes when I see other police forces reporting about, oh, we don't understand how different systems work in the UK. Some of it has to do with voting and things like first past the post, and the fact that on a single issue you might be able to knock somebody out either of a seat, or also that, for example, if this was an issue when the government had a proposal in the Labour government to allow two maids and two prostituted women and a maid to work together without that constituting a brothel, because our definition of brothel, which comes from case law, is more than one woman using the space either at the same time or consecutively. A difficulty with that, which had nothing to do with the criminal law, was that there would have to be a change of use in the planning system, and that would be a public document, and that because people would immediately be concerned that their property values might go down, it's very likely that you'd have some action. And these sort of political things influence quite a lot of what is or isn't possible with some of the things that the people who were demanding these different initiatives, pro-prostitution initiatives, I don't think they always grasp how things can happen. Because if you had looked at what happened in Edinburgh and other places, for example, you might have expected what happened in Holbeck. And because what really you were signaling, if you were saying that a particular area had been selected for that, was that you either felt that there was no possibility of anybody being voted out for doing that, or of any successful direct action, or that you were sort of somehow signaling to other people that that was the case, and then you would also make the area a magnet for a lot of other things, including drug dealers, and it would all have been predictable from what had happened previously. So these are the National Police Chiefs Council's National Policing Sex Work and Prostitution Guidance. This is a document which they have for trying to have a sort of a single focus on through all the different police forces about what they do. And it says, for example, this guidance offers practical advice to those dealing with sex work related issues, recognizes the need to address community concerns, but also stresses as a priority the duty that police services have to enhance the safety of sex workers and find practical ways to address crimes against them. And then also says the presence of organized criminal activity is unquestionable and causes great harm to individuals and communities, and it's their responsibility to robustly investigate it. Well, you notice from that, they're effectively saying that there are situations in which the community concerns would be lesser than what they see as the issue around safety of sex workers. But at the same time, we also know, and something that's really crucial for the Nordic model generally is, you know, what other alternatives there are, and what safety of sex workers to be persuaded to leave has to have to do with a lot of other things. And I find it curious that they see themselves, in spite of the policing by consent thing is the general principle about policing, but in this particular case, they have put the issue that it's worth going against a community in order to put a particular area of a managed area in a particular place. They didn't, for they says lots of things in this document about there's a lot of sort of rhetoric about things like stakeholders and speaking to communities, but they didn't really address the community of demand. And one thing I thought was interesting, when there was a lot of stuff on social media about the residents and people around Holbeck taking photographs of the vehicles, which the police were clearly not doing in connection with curb crawlers, was that sort of possibly suggesting to the police that it might be a good idea to speak to the community of demand rather than saying communities, when what you actually mean is that you have spoken to various people, some of them self-appointed, in an area which you have decided to have received that, and also the surrounding difficulties it caused. And this is an issue about disclosure of criminal records. So I already mentioned that things like housing and other issues around inequality and its austerity and income inequality are really, really fundamental in what and sort of background factors in why a lot of people, both women, become involved in prostitution, and also why it's very difficult to leave. And this slide is about a particular obstruction which is placed on people if they have convictions. And in November 2020, the rules about disclosure of convictions were changed, and this was a result of 3 women who had convictions for loitering and soliciting from more than 20 years ago, being supported by the Centre for Women's Justice. And the rules were changed, but the convictions which are now regarded as protected, they are not immune from disclosure altogether. They will be retained on the police national computer for the woman's lifetime, and a record could still be disclosed within the criminal justice system and for certain other purposes. So the women concerned have made a further challenge about this indefinite retention of their criminal records, because that was opposed by the National Police Chiefs Council and by the Home Office. And the judges recognized that the impact of the retention of records of what is really the records of the abuse of these women could be distressing and degrading for them and could interfere with their ability to move on. But they still felt that the public interest in maintaining a comprehensive record of convictions far outweighed the personal interests of the claimants. And it's puzzling that the National Police Chiefs Council, which said that in relation to the records, is the same police council which then says that the interests of the safety of sex workers comes even above communities in terms of what they're doing with their overall policies. They have a completely different view, and they're effectively obstructing moving forward of people trying to exit the sex industry, because also, I mean, you couldn't really have a better way of defeating your claimed approach, which is that you support those involved in prostitution to leave, than to claim that it's necessary to maintain their records. And also, the particular offences that are involved there, which are loitering and soliciting, where the police to decide to take action against someone for that today, those offences are not notifiable to the Home Office, and there's no requirement to record them for data purposes on the main system. They're sort of internal data, and yet it is considered necessary for these offences, which this would not happen to now, because they are trying to make the emphasis more on the sort of bigger, the more serious offences. They wouldn't even be recorded, and yet they would be preventing people from moving forward without having this record behind them. Because also the enhanced DBS certificates, which you would need to get for many jobs, including social and healthcare positions, they may also take information of those sorts of records if the police consider it relevant. So again, it's for the police to decide. I find that a big irony, and a lack of, I don't know whether it's that a lot of the things are happening for presentational purposes, because you can't really be sincere in your position and then have that kind of a view. And I mean, there are other cases where the government has held out that the public interest in maintaining a comprehensive record outweighs the personal interest. That was the argument which the UK government brought repeatedly in cases about transgender people wanting to change their birth certificates and ultimately lost. But that is the argument which they are putting again about these particular convictions, that you should never be able to change them in spite of the circumstances in which you acquired them. And the case being brought by those women is likely to go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Yeah, this is what the court judgment in which they decided that the public interest favoured that the interest of the women did not matter against the need to have a coherent record. They said that circumstances in which these records could be disclosed were these: there are a small number of defined positions of utmost integrity where details of all convictions and cautions may be taken into account. Some examples: jobs activities relating to national security, the police, judicial appointments, and firearm certificates. Those positions do not receive criminal record information through the DBS, but instead they get them directly from the police national computer. And there's another irony in that for me, because we had a case a few weeks ago in the Court of Protection where a judge decided that it was lawful for people involved in the care of a disabled man to help him to access the services of women in prostitution, and so that the person who you could not get to that appointment where you made that decision if you had that type of record at any point in your life. So it's sometimes the people who are making these rulings are very distinct from anybody who ever had that kind of experience. The other unusual thing about the case with about the disability discrimination, apart from that it would be very awkward and difficult for quite some people who are involved in care work in those circumstances, is also that it's actually the organizations who provide those services, they actually discriminate in, if you were playing devil's advocate, they discriminate in restricting the number of services which these people can access. And it's they use the usual kind of euphemistic language without really explaining why that should be the case. Right? Sort of, for example, if you say that that incontinence is unacceptable, well, voluntary incontinence is acceptable. Anyway, I found that quite interesting, that those very roles where you make those sorts of decisions are ones from which that sort of thing would exclude you. So in the UK, indoor prostitution is the largest and least visible part of the sex industry. And young women who are persuaded by those people who sanitize prostitution to become involved with the sex trade, for example, while at university, are more likely to be involved with the indoor prostitution than with the street prostitution, which might give them the criminal record that we mentioned earlier. That's another reason why there's a difficulty with that judgment. But this is, indoor prostitution is mainly facilitated online through commercial websites, which exist solely or partly to advertise people for this purpose. And this these are the conclusions of a cross-party group of members of the Scottish Parliament who published a report of an inquiry into them. They found that they're a major enabler of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. They knowingly facilitate and profit from the prostitution of others, and that the ones that are the sort of market leaders, they centralize and concentrate demand online from sex buyers. And very notably, that it's not possible to claim that they provide a kind of safety for vetting clients. It's not actually possible to design out opportunities for third parties to traffic and exploit women through them. That they do not enhance women's safety. And also that existing Scottish legislation fails to prevent their operation. And more worryingly, that the scale of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation they facilitate vastly outstrips the policing capacity to respond to it. That is true with a lot of organized crime in general, that the assets that the organizations that run these things have exceed the capacity of the state. But it's rather alarming to find that, and that can result, I think, sometimes in fatalism on the part of who is the law enforcement about how these things work. It also mentions that the current UK-wide law enforcement collaboration with these websites fails to meet its objectives and actually provides political cover, sort of like legitimation, to the companies that run them, and underplays the level of the threat that they pose. And then the international legal and law enforcement initiatives to tackle websites enable evidence-based action within Scotland. And I can't be the only person on here that know the way that, I mean, that was entirely my experience, was accessing clients through a website. And it is certainly my experience with all of those things, that it was absolutely impossible. Your number would be out there and people would contact you directly. And the other thing that used to happen a lot to me, partly because of the sort of whereabouts I was, the kind of services I was doing, was I about every kind of month or
I apologize, Esther, we are running out of time.
Oh, right, sure. Yeah,
I absolutely love the presentation. I don't want to miss anything.
No problem, no problem. I was good. I've just put these up here because this is the violence against women and
so
girls
important
strategy.
right.
And the Home Office has put this out with the second strand. The first strand is about a public consultation, which only lasted 10 weeks. The second involves focus groups from academics, experts, and those exploring emerging and evolving forms of violence against women through submissions and focus groups. But this part is where the subjects to be covered include prostitution, sex work, commercial exploitation, trafficking, and modern slavery. So this is not the part where they're interested in people's opinions coming in from the general public. It's who these experts are and how they would be selected. That would be quite, I mean, to me, that's a way, as has happened in the past, of certain information being filtered out if it isn't convenient. This is the Scottish government strategy, which said most specifically that they were taking action on all forms of violence against women and girls, and they meant directed at women and girls precisely because they are women and girls, carried out predominantly by men, stemming from systemic, deep-rooted women's inequality, and which includes domestic abuse, commercial sexual exploitation, and other forms of violence. And that's quite an emphatic statement compared with what has come out of the Home Office. And this was a consultation that they did, came out early this year, about proposals on prostitution, removing all penalties and prosecution, greater focus on deterring those who buy sex, adaptations to policy and support for women, addressing how it's been affected by technology, and the underlying systemic advantages that women and girls experience. So there's a little bit I just wanted to say about, I think, the great quote from John Dewey, the kind of educational philosopher: the way in which a problem is conceived determines what specific suggestions are entertained and which are dismissed. And that many studies about the influence of globalized online sexual violence, you can see them as being conclusion driven, and in the framing of the questions and in the sorts of issues that one is free to discuss in academia. And researchers claiming an interest in investigating the extent of sexism among men in their samples, for example. I find this really quite amusing sometimes. They frequently reveal class bias and a lack of accounting for performative anti-sexism, and the researchers' constraints on being able to match what men in their samples say with what they do in private. And also the perceptions of what a global city is includes access to, the perception that what a global city is includes access to prostitution is sexist by default. You can, once you're in there, you're already in a sexist paradigm. But the example that I find quite amusing is that for asking people, that some men who were at a sex expo in Las Vegas about their attitudes, and then deciding that they were not sexist. And if we would look at things like who is carrying out the domestic and caring responsibilities at home, and or what's the view of the man towards the husband, the wife earning more than him. And you can just imagine the researcher having to make that call. Mrs. X.
Esther, sister, we are 10 minutes over.
Oh, right.
I can listen for you.
No. I just wanted to point out that it's really important
to
look at how these questions are constructed, because they tell you before you even look at the research what the answer is going to be. And that is it, really. I just wanted to put this question because I find that with a lot of the things that are asked.
Thank you so much, Esther. And the UK is such a fascinating place. This is a war of daughters of light against the sons of darkness. So strong decriminalization forces and very strong abolitionist forces. Let's see what happens in the next years. Thank you so much for analyzing this.